Hannah said, as Hannah said, my name's Gary Don. I'm Executive Director of UN House Scotland. And on behalf of UNHS, I'm delighted to welcome you to this roundtable on a humanitarian approach to human rights in Afghanistan. This is actually the second roundtable organised by our human rights team. The first was last March on the incorporation of humanitarian principles into human rights law in Scotland. At that event, we heard about the success at the UN of shifting the discourse on nuclear weapons from machinery to humanitarian consequences. And this resulted in a UN treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, TPNW, which is even more important today than it was last year. We thought it was important last year, but by goodness, it's a lot more important today, isn't it? This year's event, like last year's roundtable, is an opportunity for presenters, participants, and attendees to share concerns about human rights. We hope to illuminate the importance of focusing on humanitarian principles as the building block for discussions on human rights in Afghanistan. Our events have been organised by a wonderful team of interns at UNHS. Under the very able leadership of Hannah Shono, they have created the vision of this roundtable. They've invited the presenters and organised all aspects of today's event. They're a remarkable group of exceptionally able young people, some of whom you will meet on this virtual platform today. So it's my great pleasure now to pass to Hannah, who is going to introduce the roundtable itself. Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you so much, Gary. So I'm Hannah Shono. I'm the coordinator of the Human Rights team at United Nations House Scotland. I would just like to say hello and welcome to everyone who's attending our roundtable on Afghanistan today. Just to echo what Gary has said, it is incredibly important, especially given what's happening in the world today, that we talk about humanitarian principles and human rights in the same conversation together. And following on from this roundtable, the Human Rights team will be writing up a follow-up report, which we will hope to share with all of you attending today. A quick note that unfortunately Scott Smith from the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan is unable to attend today, but we are delighted to be joined by Lenny, Linke and Fiona Frazer, both from UNAMA. Today we'll be hearing from a variety of speakers from different backgrounds and perspectives on the current situation in Afghanistan. Professor Rick Fawn from the University of St. Andrews, Lenny, Linke and Fiona Frazer from the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, Sir William Patey, the chairman of Turquoise Mountain Trust in Afghanistan and a former British ambassador to Afghanistan, Najibullah Samim, the CEO of the Afghan Family Guidance Association, and this will be followed by a response from Dr. Leoni Connah from the University of Manchester. So I'd like to thank all of our guest speakers for being here with us today to share your invaluable experiences and expertise. Following on from our speakers, this event will be followed by a question and answer session where you will all have an opportunity to raise questions to our speakers. Speakers as well, please feel free to raise questions to each other. You may write your questions in the chat box at any time during the event, including now even. We will collate all your questions in the Q&A session, and the Q&A will then transition hopefully into a discussion where you may raise points or perspectives of your own to contribute to our discussion on our wider discussion on the implementation of humanitarian principles and human rights. So before I introduce our first speaker, a few housekeeping notes. This event is being recorded. So if you don't wish to be recorded, if you wish to not be recorded, please turn your camera off. Please also make sure that you are muted if you are not speaking, as a courtesy to anyone speaking. And if you would like to speak during the Q&A and discussion session, please use the raise hand function, and we will also reiterate this again later. So thank you everyone for your patience and understanding. I am delighted to now introduce our first speaker, Professor Rick Fawn. Rick is Professor of International Relations at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. He focuses on security issues with a geographic focus on post-communist countries, ranging from Central Europe to Central Asia. Welcome, Rick. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It probably is normal to say that it's an honor and privilege to speak, but I very, very much mean that. And I'll also start with a self-effacing comment, which is that I have by far the least knowledge, insight, and experience to speak to this group. And I am among those waiting to hear from the very impressive group assembled today. So I think this is a tremendous opportunity for all of us. In the very few minutes that I have, I'll make 6, but rest assured, very brief points. The first is, as somebody who's worked for some time on a conglomeration of states, I'm painfully aware of how we can be distracted. So as we think perhaps about other things, I was deeply moved and really, really pleased that you are organizing the event that you do, because I was deeply concerned last year with the withdrawal and what that would mean for the future of Afghanistan. And that is before now the situations that we face in Europe. And I say that as somebody who's worked on countries like Georgia and Ukraine over many, many years, as well as post-Soviet Central Asia. And I saw, frankly, how attention briefly was on Georgia, and then it was eclipsed, then to Ukraine in 2014, which was eclipsed by Syria and onwards. So really my first point, my first concern would be the intensities of distraction, the short-termism that we may have, and now obviously with the conflagration in Europe, that will concentrate the very capacities, the minds that could be and should be assisting Afghanistan. So again, credit to you, and I look forward to others speaking to how we continue to raise awareness and work significantly, practically to help Afghanistan. A second issue I would raise is having some knowledge of Central Asia, that is post-Soviet countries north of Afghanistan, and knowing also that these were some of the least developed parts of the Soviet Union. I'm struck at the potentialities for Afghanistan, so that in a Tajikistan with relatively low levels of development under the Soviet period, we still had near universal literacy, numeracy, high levels of social provision, education, and so forth, and industrial development. And there's no reason that that could not be replicated in Afghanistan. We all know that there's a tremendous overlap of peoples. So that's speaking about potentialities and possibilities. I'm concerned also as a third point, and this is something that I've tried to track in my small ways over a long time, as to how the essential words of human rights defense have been corrupted. And we see that particularly now, but it's a long-standing thing. So as human rights advocates, defenders, I think we have a particular call to maintain the true meanings of human rights, not to allow genocide to be used in flippant and flagrant ways. And I'm afraid we're going to hear and see even more of that in coming days. Another point I would make in terms of experience with Afghanistan, I've had the privilege of knowing and working with a number of Afghans. I supervised a PhD that was done by an Afghan. I had known this person for a great number of years. I would say that he did it at a university even more ancient than St. Andrews. And even though knowing him, he had written in the start of the thesis that his mother, who was illiterate, had sewed items of clothing and small bags through the nights so that he could learn English and become the person that he is. And I'm going to say on an individualized level, I would be very, very concerned about that kind of loss in the future. And of course, I think that's going to be even more pronounced in gender terms. And that brings me to a fifth point, which is I am interested very much to hear what others will have to say about the Taliban, but I am concerned that out of desperation, many Western governments were somewhat accommodating of the Taliban and desperately looking for words of encouragement, which came with some nice words and sometimes in English. But to me, without perhaps the knowledge that many others here will have, this is unfortunately a terrible facade, and one that we need to keep very much in check. And another point, more of a final point that I would make, is that we now have a scenario where coming back to what I said earlier, our attention focus is even going to be less. And while we have those with great diplomatic experience also speaking, and I admire those who can make potent points while still maintaining decorum, perhaps I have the freedom not to do that. And I would raise a certain amount of concern about China in the occasions that arise, and in the occasions even before the current situation now with Ukraine. Chinese inroads throughout the region, Central Asia, where I've seen it in some ways, tracked it, is incredibly powerful in terms of economic industrial development, and also as we think of it as being unconditional assistance. And in many regards, I think that's a fallacy. I think it is actually conditioned assistance, and that is especially with the Belt and Road Initiative, which is going to have a tremendous impact on Afghanistan, that it comes in with something of a different world vision, and one that is, I would say, rather exclusionary. And this is going to be a very, very difficult dimension for all of us to deal with. Tremendous amount of influence with a lot of material benefit tied to it. So really, to open this discussion, to which I look very much forward to, I would make two final points. One is to make an appeal on the basis of self-interest, and that should work especially for governments. If there's a learning lesson from the past decades, it's for us not to neglect parts of the globe. I mean, that's the real one big takeaway from 9/11, and that had to be a heck of an event in order for minds to be focused. I fear that we are not retaining those lessons. But the second is that I think we really do owe it to the Afghan people. And I salute this effort today, and I really look forward to the discussion that will follow. So thank you very, very much for allowing me to make these opening comments.
Thank you very much, Rick, for your excellent introduction to the situation in Afghanistan and for starting off our presentation. Just a reminder to everybody that if anyone has any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat. So my name is Christina Kelly, and I'm now delighted to introduce our next two speakers, both from the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, who will be presenting together, Lenny Linke and Fiona Frazer. So Lenny Linke is a senior political affairs officer at the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan. She has over 10 years of experience working in and on Afghanistan, Yemen, and Somalia. And her colleague, Mrs. Fiona Frazer, has been the representative of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in Afghanistan since 2019, since August of 2019. And she also serves as the Human Rights Chief within the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan. Welcome, Lenny and Fiona. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we'd like to thank you also for having us tonight. I'll provide a bit more sort of the political context, and my colleague Fiona will go into the actual work that UNAMA is doing on human rights in the current context. So I'd like to make two key points. First of all, sort of on the paper, on the mechanisms of how we operate. Our new mandate that is currently under elaboration in New York, and sort of the proposal is very much a people-centered one. And so we've been forced to sort of move to this kind of terminology and people-centered, sort of in quotation marks, so to say, due to some of the anxiety and nervousness of some of the members of the Security Council, that there's any direct assistance, so to say, to the de facto authorities, such as the Taliban, that would sort of take any steps towards conferring any legitimacy on them. And so this is maybe also one lesson that we have learned in the process, that we only so much now focusing on the people-centered approach. Well, I think this is also something we could have done earlier in the past months already. And there's also sort of this realization has come out of the fact that we see a repeat of mistakes in the past. From the 1980s onwards of peace agreement with the Soviet withdrawal, for example, there was the exclusion of the Mujahideen from the negotiations. And then, of course, also as part of the Bonn process, as Brahimi put it, sort of in quotation mark, the original sin of having sort of excluded the Taliban at the time. And so these are sort of mistakes that were made in the past of sort of more focusing on trying to bring the fighting elites to the table rather than really are trying to understand what the population and the people on the ground are feeling or what sort of their desires are moving forward. And maybe the 2002 emergency law Jirga was a bit of an exception in this context, but there we see that there are opportunities to do so. It just really takes the will to focus on sort of making sure that beyond the fighting elites, of which of course have to be engaged, we also see that other populations are included. The second point I like to make is sort of also the dilemmas that we face with the human rights approach in the current context. And my colleague Fiona will speak to a little bit more exactly what UNAMA is doing. But I just want to sort of highlight that when the Taliban took over, it really sort of exposed the fundamental dilemmas of how we can actually help people when there's a regime that has very little respect for human rights. And that regime is very much in power and is leaving very little space for the population to sort of express their will. Now, UNAMA partly sort of managed to get around this dilemma since September by focusing mostly on humanitarian issues. This is also what sort of Security Council at the time felt comfortable with, and is also what we've sort of continuing to emphasize. But of course, you can only provide humanitarian handouts for so long, and it's not sustainable, and it's also not, of course, not conducive to human dignity. So this is sort of all a work in progress, and depending, I think, on how the mandate renewal goes, we can then sort of test our hypothesis how sort of the people-centered approach can really sort of address these dilemmas of human rights in the current context. And with that, I'll hand over to my colleague Fiona. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lenny. And I just echo what Lenny said. Thanks very much for inviting us both this evening here in Kabul today with you. So I thought I would just really cover two things, give you a little bit of an overview of the human rights situation of how we see it here in Afghanistan, and also a little bit of our engagement with the de facto authorities on questions around human rights. First of all, much of the work that have been done by the Human Rights Service of UNAMA to date over the decades have obviously been related to the conflict that's been going on and the impact of the conflict on civilians. We, as Lenny had said, I mean, there's obviously the keeping people centric is very key to our overall kind of idea and how we work. But I mean, really for human rights work, it's core and center. I mean, why we're in a place doing any work is to support the protection of individuals and their human rights. So much of the work that was done on was about the impact of conflict on civilian, unfortunately recording casualties and so forth. So I would just want to sort of take a step back, and in the first half of 2021, just to tell you, we, as UNAMA, we recorded some 5,100 civilian casualties, just over 1,600 killed, and the remainder injured, and of those 1,600 children, with women comprising 14% of all the civilian casualties. I say that because, as you'll all be well aware, in August, with the takeover by the Taliban of the country, we actually saw a significant reduction in hostilities, and the impact was then a significant decrease in the number of civilian casualties. And so just between August of last year and February, we documented a 78% reduction in civilian casualties in comparison to the year before. So, you know, a huge impact for individuals that in the past 6 months, we have seen, as I said, a significant reduction in hostilities. Despite that, I mean, we do, with regards, obviously, with protection of civilians, which is something we look at both from an international humanitarian law perspective as well as an international human rights law perspective, we do have those concerns do remain. And when we look at violence and that has remained, we've seen, we continue to document impact, particularly with regard to suicide attacks that we saw since August, the Hamad Karzai International Airport attack, then also two suicide attacks on Shia Muslim places of worship, as well as others. So even despite the fact we've had a significant reduction in hostilities since August, we still have documented over 1,100 civilian casualties, and approximately a third of those are actually individuals have been killed. Another key aspect that is very much wrapped up in conflict is, of course, the impact of explosive remnants of war. And these continue to cause particular harm to civilians, particularly children. And again, just in the last 6 months, we've recorded some 150 civilian casualties due to UXO, and 70% of these were children. I want to then make sort of comments on other areas that we particularly focus on without taking up too much time. Child protection, we've worked a lot on the whole 6 grave violations within children in armed conflict. That's including recruitment and use, maiming and killing, maiming and killing, as well as access to healthcare and so forth. So there's one thing of the violence, but then with the economic crisis that we have going on in Afghanistan, we see that children are severely impacted by this, with reports of child labor, sale and forced marriage of children by families who are in desperate financial situations. And of course, when it comes to the situation for children, the very well-known aspect of whole question of access to education for all children. To date, there's been no education since August for girls over the age of over the 6th grade. There have been pledges to open school by the de facto authorities from March, so we really have to see if they will abide by these commitments. But clearly that has implications for a whole generation, but also when we're looking at the whole question for us of women and girls' rights, that's one aspect, education throughout, first, secondary, and then of course university. We have had universities open in the past month, so we'll see how that goes. Then it takes us really, when it comes to women's rights, to the whole question of women in the labour force. And let's be honest, while discrimination, gender-based violence, restrictions on women and girls' fundamental rights and freedoms have existed before the 15th of August in Afghanistan, we've really noted that the policies and approaches of the de facto authorities have exacerbated existing issues and also created new ones, one of which I've mentioned already with regards to education. But then we look at the whole question of women in the workplace, and there are problems with regards to access to employment for women, particularly in the public sector. There are sort of anecdotal information about women in the private sector, but this is really something that we need to see shift, so that we have women represented throughout the sectors. Currently, yes, there are women in the health sector and to some degree in the education sector, but this is something that women very much want themselves, and has been seen in the spate of peaceful protests which actually resulted in a number of arrests of women over the past months. Then a key area that we've been focusing on is also the whole question of right to life and physical integrity. Since the 15th of August, you may well know that the de facto authorities announced guarantees of protection for certain categories under what they just termed as a general amnesty. This was for former government officials and members of the Afghan National Security Forces. Really, we have to look at this with the length of the conflict and multiple layers of grievances that have taken place in the recent history. It was perhaps a step that we weren't all particularly expecting. Despite this, these commitments, we have received credible reports of killings of former security forces personnel and individuals associated with the government. And we have at least 100, which we would attribute to the de facto authorities. This is well documented by us. And I just want to sort of be clear, when we come to doing our documentation, as you're all in the human rights sphere, you'll all very much appreciate that anything, figures, data we give is all based on verification exercise that is pretty robust, with at least 3 independent sources. But also we've seen the killing of persons, suspects or affiliates of ISL-KP, as well as civil society members. Other recorded instances of human rights violations that we've documented since August. I mean, many of them were also taking place, but particularly concerned under the de facto authorities, arbitrary detentions, enforced disappearance, incommunicado detention, and so forth. I think there are a lot of different areas that I could cover for you. I think it's important just to set out also that with, on the question of accountability, that everyone is always very keen to ensure when we're looking at the situation for human rights promotion and protection. Since August, we've seen the de facto authorities gradually working to resume a functioning countrywide justice system and courts. This does look at having this under Sharia and Islamic law. We've seen various appointments of the de facto Minister of Justice, de facto Supreme Court, primary and appeal courts, as well as we've just recently had a de facto Attorney General put in place. So we really have to see how that will all pan out. And that really leads me to sort of perhaps my concluding aspect. I mean, that as the UN Human Rights Office here, we very much look at the human rights standards, the treaty obligations that Afghanistan as a state is a party to. Governments come and go, but treaties are ratified by a state, and obligations as we see them continue, whichever government or authority is in place at the time. And that is, but one of our challenges is looking at standards, international human rights standards, and when we discuss them with the de facto authorities, while they understand that they are in place and they're part of the bigger international arena that they would like to see themselves part of, it is a question for them of often saying back to us, well, we will look at those as long as they are in compliance with Sharia Islamic law. Finally, on our engagement with the de facto authorities, we as the Human Rights Service of UNAMA have been in dialogue with the Taliban for a number of years with regards to issues on protection of civilians, detention and other such matters. Which I think really helped pave the way for us not going in, if you like, cold to discussions with the de facto authorities. Many of the individuals we already had some interaction with already. We have, through our field teams that UNAMA has throughout the country, we have then engagement with the de facto authorities, both in Kabul as well as in different provinces. And it ranges with the different de facto ministries, interior, defense, intelligence, and then the governors in the provinces. Then we have the information and culture, as well as the famously worded propagation of vice and promotion, I've got it wrong, and promotion of virtue, or maybe it's the other way around, I get in the muddle. I think what's important is that it's not business as usual, and we are really looking to engage because it's important wherever you are doing human rights work to really ensure that you have the contacts, you have the rapport, you have the serious, often difficult discussions about the human rights concerns that we record and document, and that the interventions we need to undertake with any authorities that might be in charge. So I'll leave it at there, but I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Lenny and Fiona, for your valuable insight into the international response in Afghanistan. I would just like to remind everyone that if you have any questions for any of our speakers today, you can put them in the chat and we will make sure to ask them during the Q&A. My name is Elena Gastaldo, and I'm honored to introduce my mentor, Sir William Patey. Sir William Patey was a senior British diplomat until April 2012. He served as ambassador to Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Sudan. and he was also head of the Middle East Department at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office from 1999 to 2002. Thank you, William, for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Elena. My pleasure. I suppose I've been brought in as the old wizened diplomat who has to inject a discordant note of realism and compromise. I noticed the title of my talk was to be Afghanistan and the UK, Human Rights versus National Interests. Let me widen that to say, A, because the UK is slightly less relevant in the world today than it used to be, to say that the Afghanistan and Western interests, human rights versus national interests. And I think that is an appropriate dilemma, because I had to deal, you can imagine, in the countries that I've dealt with, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Sudan, Afghanistan, I've had to deal with a lot of human rights defenders, had to defend a lot of abuses of human rights, and also had to balance the pursuit of human rights with sometimes making compromises in order to achieve wider aims. Making peace in Sudan, for instance, may have meant overlooking or not pressing as hard as you might have on human rights. But here we're in a position where it's not the dilemma between national interests and human rights. I think it's a dilemma between humanitarian assistance and human rights. That's the real dilemma in Afghanistan at the moment, because I think the reality is that Western interests in Afghanistan now are very limited. And I was struck by Rick's comments, let's not neglect parts of the world because they come and bite you back. I think that's part of the problem at the moment. The United States has lost interest in Afghanistan. The precipitate withdrawal from Afghanistan has created a humanitarian disaster that didn't need to be created. I think the Brits and other European countries, other NATO countries had no choice but to withdraw with the Americans, but we're prepared to stay longer and create a different transition, one that would have involved negotiation with the Taliban. I think I think it was Lenny who mentioned the strategic error back in Bonn, where the Taliban were not invited to the peace conference and therefore were continually at war with the government in Afghanistan. The problem we have at the moment is there is a humanitarian crisis on our doorstep. And I pay tribute to UNAMA, to the World Food Programme, to the World Health Organization, to all the UN organizations and the NGOs that are trying to alleviate this humanitarian crisis, but it won't be enough. I was at a talk at Chatham House a week ago, and David Miliband, who's the CEO of International Rescue, was very clear on the extent to which we are facing a humanitarian crisis. So at what stage does the need for humanitarian assistance overcome the issues you have on human rights? And I want to pose this to the audience because I would genuinely like to know where you stand on this. Because do we deal with the Taliban? We know that they are a medieval patriarchy that is clamping down on women, preventing, I've had reports preventing women getting medical services without having a mahram, a male guardian, preventing girls and women going to university and schools, preventing them working. We know what the Taliban are. We know what they're doing. But if everyone is dying because they don't have food, because they don't have the ability to feed their family, I mean, we've got families in Afghanistan now selling their children in order to stay alive, selling the organs from their body in order to stay alive. This is happening right now in Afghanistan in the 21st century. So the question is, what do we do about it? And I think I think Lenny and Fiona were saying the UN are doing what they can, but does it mean compromising? If you want to sustain the health service in Afghanistan, does it mean paying for the nurses, paying for the doctors, paying for the hospitals? In effect, subsidizing the Taliban government. If you want education, does it mean the international community paying for teachers to go back? And if they can't get the Taliban to allow girls to go back to school, do we not do it? These are the dilemmas. I don't know the answer. I have this. I'm chairman of the Turquoise Mountain Trust, which is a charity that is employing 8,000 Afghans. We are promoting artisanal development. There are 8,000 Afghans who rely on us for payment. They're working on carpets, on jewelry, on calligraphy, and we've been allowed to re-establish ourselves and reopen. The fortunate thing is many of the women who work for us, mainly women, work from home, so it's not an issue. But we have a real dilemma. In our Institute of Arts and Culture in downtown Kabul, the men have been allowed to go back, but the women have not. The women are working from home, they're doing online tutoring, and we're paying them. But at what stage do we say, unless women and girls are allowed on equal terms to participate in this activity, are we going to continue to support it? We haven't reached the point of no return yet, but we will have this dilemma. We've reopened our clinic, we've reopened our primary school. It's not a problem. Female teachers, female doctors have been allowed to go back to work. But these are real dilemmas and real world problems at what stage. Now, David Miliband at Chatham House asked for a straw poll on who would recognize the Taliban in order to deal with the humanitarian crisis. It was about half and half. About half the audience said they would recognize the Taliban, half said they wouldn't. Not because we think the Taliban are the future of Afghanistan or that we have any delusions about their human rights record, but stabilizing Afghanistan, creating an economy, opening a central bank, for instance, opening a central bank, allowing a central bank to open would effectively be de facto recognizing the Taliban. But without a central bank, without a banking system, it's very difficult for the Afghan economy to function in any way whatsoever. So you've got that dilemma. What do we do? Do we compromise with the Taliban? Because we know that if we say to the Taliban, there is to be no assistance unless you allow women to work, unless you allow education for women at university level, unless you allow education for women at secondary level, unless you get rid of your medieval laws on women being allowed outside the home, we're not going to provide any assistance. Do we do that or do we compromise? I'm putting this to I'm an old wizened diplomat who's made too many compromises in my life to be sound on this. I've been a pragmatist all my life. I would like to hear from this much younger audience how much they would be prepared to compromise to save the Afghan population from a catastrophe that is unfolding before them. And I fear that Rick is quite right. The focus has gone away from Afghanistan. We're all focused on war in Europe and the tragedy in in Ukraine. And when it's when it's off the TV screens, when we're not hearing it on a daily basis, I can tell you as a former government official, government will take the easy way out. They'll do nothing. And that's what they'll continue. They're under no pressure at the moment to do anything. Now, like the UN, there's de facto discussions with the Taliban, but in reality, the Western governments are going to provide the UN with money, with the wherewithal to do what they can do, but will fall short of stopping a humanitarian catastrophe in Afghanistan. So my question to this group even is, how far would you be prepared to go in dealing with the Taliban in order to alleviate a humanitarian catastrophe, even if it means dealing with an organization whose human rights record is absolutely there for everyone to see? This is not Taliban 2.0. This is Taliban 1.0, the same bunch of people who have a view of the world that is a medieval patriarchy. And so the question is, in the short term, how far are you prepared to go to deal with the humanitarian crisis whilst overlooking, I don't say you have to overlook them, but you have to, you can't make them a condition of assistance, overlooking the humanitarian crisis. I'll stop there because, I just wanted to throw that hand grenade into the discussion, and I'll be perfectly happy to come back to it at a later stage. So I'll stop there. There's 101 things you can say about Afghanistan, but that to me is the fundamental question. that needs to be addressed. And I think this is a very good forum to address it. There's a lot of you out there who've focused on human rights, done a lot of work on it, and belong to a generation that perhaps is not as cynical as my generation is.
Thank you, William, for your salient points on the UK and Afghanistan relations. Again, I would like to remind anyone if they have any questions, they can put it in the chat and we will make sure to ask them during the Q&A session. My name is Kusha Patel and I am delighted to introduce Najibullah Samim. Mr. Najibullah Samim is the CEO of the Afghanistan Family Guidance Association. He has over 24 years of working experience in different national and international organizations in executive and senior positions in humanitarian, development, and financial sectors. Welcome, Najib. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today in this important forum. It is really very important, and I appreciate your efforts for organizing this meeting. So, as introduced, I am Najibullah Samim, and I am the CEO of Afghan Family Guidance Association, an NGO which has been operating in Afghanistan since 1968. AFGA is a member of IPPF, International Planned Parenthood Organization, and we are working in the health sector, providing SRHR, sexual and reproductive health services to vulnerable people and 11 provinces of the Afghanistan. So I will speak today on three points. One is fact and challenges on the ground from a local and practical perspective. And then humanitarian approach to human rights, a model that will it work in Afghanistan in the current situation or not? And I will present few reasons for that. And then at the end, I will provide a few recommendations based on my own experience and based on the practical examples. So the, please go to the next slide. Okay, on facts in facts and challenges on the ground. So there are some a couple of good developments happening now. One is that the de facto authorities, they have allowed education for men and women. At least the universities are now open all over the countries, but there are still challenges. We are still facing a lot of challenges. We don't know about the schools, though they have promised to resume the schools in March, later in March. And also then the next good development is the accessibility to all parts of the country, and particularly to those areas where access was limited due to security concerns. So now the NGOs and the civil society organizations, they can travel and they can go to different provinces where earlier they were not able to do so. And a few of the other things that local currency, as you know, local currency is highly fluctuated and inflation has increased. So that means that ordinary Afghans loses their assets every day. And that's a big concern and of all civilians. There are some other facts that the mortality rate is 638 out of 100,000 live births, which is the highest in the region and probably also in the world. Under 5 mortality rate is 60 per 1,000 live births, which again the highest number in the region. And around 3.5 million children are out of school at the moment, and where 60% of them are girls. So that means that the children or women and children are the main victims of this dilemma. Half of under 5 children are expected to suffer from acute malnutrition. So this is increasing day by day. This number may increase over a couple of months. And then 11 million people are severely food insecure. And some international organizations like WHO and others, they are trying to overcome that challenge, but that is not an easy job. That takes time, and a lot of issues and challenges are ahead of us. Next slide, please. Okay, let me continue with the facts and challenges on the ground. Challenges of women and children, as my colleagues from UNAMA also say that women participation is very limited in all sectors. So still their participation in the education sector, in the health, their travel are banned somehow. They cannot travel without having a mahram. Employment, particularly in the public sector and also in the private sector, is limited, and their rights to raise their voices for their basic human rights or basic needs is somehow limited. And women workers should be accompanied by a mahram. That is something, has made the women very worried and made it difficult for them to live in a normal case. So that mahram thing is also makes employment difficult for qualified women who does not have the mahram. So in certain cases, though is a woman or a girl is qualified for a position, qualified for an employment, but since they do not have the mahram or a male member of their family, so they cannot be recruited. So this means that there are restrictions on the employment of these. So the three pictures on this slide, if you can see the left, the first left photo says it indicates that there are a lot of women are waiting for Afghan health clinic, mobile health clinic to arrive, and they're waiting for the health clinic. In the second picture, you see that because of the limitation, the mobile van cannot provide all the services for all these women. So therefore, they have to be chosen, or they are giving the numbers and they have to be lined in queue. So the mobile clinic can only provide up to 60 to 70 services for 70 clients, but then you can see the numbers are more than 100. And the third photo shows that the mobile van of Afghan is arriving, and the women are in line so they can get the health services. So that indicates that a huge number of women are seeking for free health services where the public hospitals cannot provide. So that indicates the severity of the issue in the health sector. Good. Next slide, please. Okay, and women and children are the main victims. As my colleagues also said, access is limited to education, health, and recreational activities. So, the children and women cannot go freely to the parks and to the recreational activities. And even if they go, then they have to have their mahram with them. And that is really an issue. Bad economic situation, which again that affects the children and women. Child labor, street beggars, robbers, and criminal activities has increased, unfortunately, because of the bad economic situation. And not only that, but also because of the bad economic situation, a lot of young boys, they are willing to go and be a combatant and joined the de facto authorities in the military forces. So that is again, and if you can see the two pictures here, the girls and women, they are raising their voice, but they cannot be allowed, to do so. Next slide, please. And coming to the humanitarian space, in the humanitarian space, there are a lot of challenges. And I will just point a few of those examples. Funding constraints post August 15, local NGOs have lesser chance of accessing fund or grants compared to international organizations or international NGOs. And that has made many of the NGOs, local NGOs, has to be closed and close their operation. Bank cash and liquidity challenges. This is really one of the biggest challenge currently in the humanitarian space, where local NGOs and civil society organizations are facing at the moment. That has limited humanitarian response in employment. And I will give you an example of Afghan. Since August last year, when the Taliban took over the country, we have not been able to receive funds from the UK, and because of the sanctions and because of the limitation. So you can imagine that our employees have not received their salaries since November last year. So for 4 months, they have been waiting for their salaries. And additionally, since we could not receive funding, so our operation has badly affected. In some cases, we have to suspend some of our very needed projects, and that's an issue. That's because of the sanctions, and that means that we will, or we are not able to provide the needed services in the health sector. And the third challenge for in the humanitarian space, particularly for the civil society organization in NGOs, the short-term projects. So currently, because the big donors, they have banned their projects or their funding for the development activities, and nowadays almost the majority of the fund are coming for humanitarian short-term projects, where these are somehow, I should say that it's less effective and has badly affected employment and their sustainability. In case of NGOs, once you have to complete like 3 or 4 months projects of humanitarian projects, and then, you know, again, you have to apply to go for recruitment, and that they take cost a lot for the NGOs. Next slide, please. And the next challenge is bureaucratic impediments. So significant delays in approval of new projects by the de facto authorities or completing approval of the completed projects. More control on the civil society organizations, that causes actually delays and affect their neutrality and independence. A restriction on gender and children related programs. We have already witnessing that, and many of the projects on gender, women empowerment, and gender-based violence are closed by some of the NGOs after August 15 last year. Interference of the authorities in selection of beneficiaries and staff recruitment, and this is basically due to the lack of their knowledge of the humanitarian principles. Next slide. And now I'm coming to the humanitarian approach to human rights model. I think that could be an appropriate model in Afghanistan now. And the reasons that why I'm saying that the international community are not engaged directly with the de facto authorities at the moment, and lack of enough capacity of the authorities in service delivery and responding to the existing challenges by the de facto authorities, and low level of their capacity on planning and execution of humanitarian initiative. And more than that, while authorities do not care much about the human rights projects, I think donors may complement through implementation of a holistic humanitarian approach. So the international community and donors, they have somehow the responsibility of taking care of the human rights and human approach. So these are, you know, some of the reasons, but there are a lot of other reasons for this humanitarian approach to the human rights. Next slide, please. And I have few recommendations from my own knowledge of the on the ground. So international community to engage with the de facto authorities to first create an enabling environment for the CSOs to operate or implement humanitarian projects. So this is a responsibility of the international community at the moment, and also to prevent them from making further hurdles for the CSOs to operate. They are currently making a lot of control over the CSOs. So therefore, the international community needs to be engaged with them, to prevent them from making further hurdles. Provide financial assistance to CSOs to implement humanitarian projects. And you can see the two photos. The left one is the Afghan mobile clinic, where it provides health services for the vulnerable population at their doorsteps. And the second one is the capacity building activities, or the for women and girls in different provinces. So such projects and such initiatives can help to somehow respond to the human rights through the humanitarian approach. These are the recommendations. Next slide. Okay, the third recommendation is local NGOs or CSOs should not be ignored. These are basically the product of the 2 decades of international presence in Afghanistan. And this mechanism should not be destroyed, and this mechanism should not let me go. Support local NGOs and CSOs. They are cost effective from one side and able to reach the last miles in the country. They have the experience and they have the ability. And the fifth one, which is more important, Afghanistan should not be left alone again. The mistake that has happened years back, and if so, I think that will cost much to all of us. Monitor closely the human rights violations and take prompt actions and engage with the government. In the 2 photos I'm showing on this slide is Afghan's celebration of the International Youth Day, but that was before August last year, and the second photo indicates the celebration or campaign of the International HIV/AIDS Day. And I think these were my recommendations, but I will be happy to provide any further clarification on information on what I presented today. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity again. Back to you.
Thank you, Najib, for your really important points on the real need for a humanitarian response. My name is Tia Sosrojoyo, and I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Leoni Connah as our respondent. Dr. Connah is currently a lecturer in politics at the University of Manchester. She has an interdisciplinary background, and her research interests are centered around South Asian security. She has presented at numerous conferences and has publications in Peace Review, South Asia's Research, Global Change, Peace and Security. Thank you so much for joining us today, Leoni. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for everyone who's attended, both speakers and the audience as well. I think it's really important, and I'm really happy to be here. So I'm grateful, particularly to Hannah as well, who's helped organise this, and everybody else who's been a part of it. It's really good. So I suppose my role, or I don't know, position here is to kind of respond to what everyone's been saying. So I've kind of jotted down some reflections and some things that I wanted to add as well. So kind of going step by step to try and recap what other people have said, and to just add my own little bits onto that. So I thought it was really useful what Rick was saying about this idea that, you know, we are distracted at the moment, with good reason to be, but the situation in Afghanistan doesn't go away. It's not going to go away. So it's important to kind of bring the narrative back and think about this and think about, okay, well, you know, what's next? What can be done? In terms of what can be done, you know, there's going to be many suggestions, and has been suggestions in this panel, and it's thinking about, you know, what's realistic. You know, I've been to quite a lot of events on these issues, and it's thinking about the way in which Afghanistan is in limbo, the ways in which in Afghanistan, you know, with the mistakes that have been made in the past, and I guess, you know, have the international community learned from those mistakes? Have they not? How can they learn from those mistakes? And some of Rick's comments is what got me thinking about that, thinking about how unrealistic promises have been made in the past, you know, to say, oh, we're going to, particularly with the West, we're going to go into Afghanistan and we're going to do this, and have these, you know, big ambitions and big ideas that haven't necessarily paid off, and if anything have made things worse. So it's thinking about that and thinking about the unrealistic expectations that have been set in the past, and making sure that that doesn't happen in the future, to give people, especially the people in Afghanistan, unrealistic hope. You know, there's got to be some element, not necessarily being cynical, but some element of realism to say that, well, actually, this is what can be done right now, instead of saying, oh, this is what can be done, I don't know, in 10 years. And then what Lenny and Fiona were pointing to was really important, you know, all the different ways in which different companies, NGOs, you know, UNAMA are helping the situation on the ground, but also the ways in which that some of these things aren't sustainable. You know, there's only so many things that can be done, especially from a humanitarian perspective. So it's thinking about that as well. Again, accepting this idea of what's realistic now versus what can be done in the long term. So I thought that was really important. I also thought it was important to consider the complexity of protecting human rights. When, you know, Afghanistan's under a regime that has essentially rendered them meaningless. So again, it's balancing the issues of the Taliban being back in power and considering how human rights can still be protected. Also, you know, moving on toward more thinking about women's rights and the rights of women and children, I think it's really important to not return to the narratives and the assumptions that were projected 20 years ago, this idea of saving women and women being helpless and overlooking, you know, there's real caution of overlooking women's efforts, especially with resistance, especially with the efforts that women are helping out with in terms of charities that are on the ground. So I think there's a real danger there of falling into those assumptions again of, oh, it's just, you know, the West need to go in and help these women again, because that's what caused a lot of problems in the past. And especially not to forget that, you know, there are other victims in this conflict as well. That does not say or does not mean that, you know, that there isn't these real atrocities on the ground that are happening and that women are facing, because that is true. But it's also important to acknowledge, you know, the importance and the role that we're going to play in as well. And then moving on to what William was saying, I think is really important, is this idea of balancing contradictions. You know, there's a lot of ambition to help and, you know, what can we do in Afghanistan, but then also you can't ignore the Taliban. You know, there's just no way that you can ignore them. So to assume that, oh, you know, we can provide financial aid or we can intervene in that way, but just for some reason ignore the Taliban isn't, again, realistic. They can't, you know, I don't think they can be ignored. That's not to say that, you know, you don't want to fall into this narrative, especially in the public eye, of, oh, we're negotiating with the Taliban, or this idea of negotiating with terrorists, or whatever assumptions people make. But at the same time, how can you have any meaningful conversation or meaningful change in Afghanistan without acknowledging the fact that the Taliban are in control? You know, it just doesn't seem that you can have the two things go together. Which then moves on nicely to what Naji was saying about the challenges. You know, we've identified the challenges, people understand the challenges, and I suppose it's about working within them. You know, you can't ignore them, you can't get around them. So how do you work within the challenges to still implement effective change? And I suppose obviously it's about finding a way of doing that helps the situation. You know, we know, I mean, at least I'm in agreement that the economic situation is probably the biggest challenge in Afghanistan right now. You know, the ways in which that the assets are frozen, the money that is in banks that people can't access. That is, you know, a huge problem. It's going to cause mass starvation. It's going to cause mass malnutrition. You know, people are starving, and that's no exaggeration. You know, the statistics that are coming in and the reports that are coming in that have already been mentioned by previous panelists, these things are actually happening. So how do you raise awareness for that? How do you explain and bring the focus back to Afghanistan to say, well, what can we do? You know, there's all this money that's frozen and that people can't access. So, you know, how can that be solved? And, you know, without going into the legalities of it and the complexities within the political situation, you know, there's a sense of real urgency here that people need this money. You know, people need access to basic facilities and they need basic access to food, and that's not going to, you know, that kind of leverage, economic leverage, doesn't work over the Taliban, or at least it won't work over the Taliban, because you know, the humanitarian call is probably more important. And, you know, as it's already been said, if you say to the Taliban, oh, we're not going to give you this money unless you agree to let women go to school, that isn't going to work. So it's finding a way in which that people can still access their assets without, you know, it coming across as, oh, you're funding the Taliban or you're giving the Taliban money. But essentially, there's no, you know, there is no middle ground here. It's either there is a compromise and the money goes back into the Afghani civilian society and people are able to access resources again, or what happens, you know, what is the outcome? Millions of people are going to starve, there'll be a refugee crisis, and then what? Then it'll be back on the news in the UK because there's a refugee crisis, instead of acknowledging it when they needed to. You know, all of these problems are all interconnected, and there's no right way of suggesting a way of moving forward. But in terms of aid and in terms of what needs to be done, it has to be immediate. You know, I'm not saying, and I don't think other people are saying, you know, let's plan this 10-year idea of how we can help Afghanistan. It's not the case. I think it's the case of what we need to do now and what people are asking for now. And essentially that's food and water and supplies. It's not this long-term democratic plan of uplifting, you know, human rights for women and girls. It's although that might be part of it, is what can we do right now? And yeah, just to finish, because I know I've rambled a bit, but it's just, I agree with what Najib was saying. You know, we kind of owe it to Afghanistan not to leave this alone and not to forget about it and not to let these distractions, which is what Rick said at the beginning, so it quite, you know, ties together quite nicely. Not let these distractions overtake the importance and the urgency of the situation in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you, Lenny, for your really helpful summary and response. We will now move into the questions and discussion part of our session. As a team under Christina has collated all questions or points to raise, please feel free to either put them in the chat or raise your hand. Christina, could you take us through the first set of questions? Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Tia. So we're going to start by asking some questions, and as the speakers respond, if anyone has any follow-up points that they want to raise or any additional questions, please feel free to raise your hand, and we'll move back and forth between the questions that have already been sent and anyone's reactions to any of the answers to these questions now. So we'll start chronologically with the first presentation from Lenny and Fiona. We got a few questions regarding the technicalities of documenting human rights violations. So Mohammed Bashir asked, like, what specifically are the human rights violations that you document with the UNAMA? And Jerry Bailey asked how the Taliban takeover has impacted the effectiveness of data gathering. So I thought those kind of grouped together, and if either Lenny or Fiona would be able to give some insight on that, that would be lovely.
Okay, well, maybe I just jump in on the range of human rights violations and abuses that we're documenting. I mentioned it starts with, right to life, so it's extrajudicial summary executions, enforced disappearances, arbitrary and incommunicado detentions, allegations of ill treatment and torture. So there's that aspect of it, but it's also the violations when it comes to access to healthcare, education, and as well impact on freedom of expression and opinion. Something I didn't actually mention particularly is the concerns that we have with regard to the pressure that's being placed on civil society activists, resulting in there's been various arbitrary arrests. So it's I just want to sort of make the point that you know, when we talk about a humanitarian crisis that is obviously clearly going on, at the core of this, when we actually look down at it, it's about, as people have said, people not being able to, so it's people needing food, shelter, medical treatment, and so on. And if you think about that, those are the basics of what we would all like to have in life, and they are actually about access to food. It's the right to food. So it's human rights that are at the core of a humanitarian crisis. When it comes to documentation, we take the approach wherever we work on human rights, wherever we are in the world as human rights professionals of, we will have a concern being brought to us. We will aim to interview, if possible, victims, witnesses, we will then, or relatives, a range of sources, and we will take those issues to the authority or to those who we believe are responsible. And that is the work that we have to do, whoever is in power. And right now for us, and I think for a while, it's the de facto authorities, the Taliban, and that is what we're aiming to do. That's why I was also stressing the importance of having engagement.
Great, thank you very much. Like I said, if anyone has any points that arise from this, please raise your hand. But moving on from that, we had a question from Fiona's presentation that is also similar to a question that arose from Najib's presentation, which is in Fiona's presentation, it kind of arose that given that you're trying to focus on a people-centered approach, how does that contrast with like state-led human rights obligations, and how do those kind of two approaches or ideologies conflict in any way? And then in Najib's presentation, we got some questions regarding practical like implementations of recommendations that were being suggested, and if sanctions weren't working, which is something that is used by the international community, then what is a potential alternative that might be better? So if either Najib or Fiona would like to speak, or any of the other speakers, that would be great. Thank you. Yes, Lenny.
Just to speak on, yeah, what you're mentioning about sanctions, I think this has been for UNAMA a main concern, especially on the political side, because we see that the sanctions have very limited effect on those individuals who are actually on the sanctions list themselves. There's a small number of individuals compared to, of course, the overall population. And that, of course, presents a huge dilemma. Now, maybe segueing a little bit into what was also mentioned by other speakers, the problem also is that we're trying to leverage the Taliban with the sanctions. But I think unlike other regimes, just sort of looking at some of the other sanctions that have been in place in the past, the Taliban might seem so least affected by the sanctions in a sense. And in particular, there's been this paradigm before August 2021 that the previous Afghan government, you could do a lot of leverage of money. You would say, we give you development assistance. In return, we want sort of certain human rights obligations to be met, certain other issues to be addressed. Now, the Taliban has made it very explicit that they would like to have humanitarian assistance, which sort of, you shouldn't put conditionality on that. But they are not as interested in development assistance. So you take away that leverage point that has worked in the past really well. And in addition to that, they're also asking more for investment and try to support private sector investment on those sides, which of course is now crippled by the fact that sort of banks are sort of under lockdown or have sanctions or have sort of other restrictions. So this traditional how you use sanctions does not work in Afghanistan. Now, what that leaves you with is sort of very sort of, yeah, unsatisfactory ways of sort of pressuring them. And there's been a lot of push on that as well. And just in recent days, we had an event where actually there are several individuals raised the issue. We need to rethink what we can do, how we can apply leverage, how to maybe isolate some leverage from the human rights, so that those are sort of from the humanitarian side, sorry, so that you don't have to maintain humanitarian impartiality on that and humanitarian principles on that front, but find other ways to apply pressure. And so I think that sort of international community seems to have a very sort of one reaction to these kind of regime changes or sort of regimes that do not respect human rights. And so that does not always work. So this is also, I think, with the people-centric approach now in the mandate as well, we're trying to address this a little bit, or at least sort of to point that direction that other mechanisms need to be relied upon.
Thank you. William, would you like to contribute?
Yes, on the sanctions issue, I mean, I don't think sanctions are the big issue at the moment. I mean, there are sanctions against individuals, the whole of the Taliban government, exactly, because of their terrorist links. And nobody's going to lift sanctions on the Haqqani network. Sirajin Haqqani is a well-established terrorist. He happens to be the Minister of Interior, but nobody's going to lift sanctions on him. And they've been pretty flexible. We got from the Office for Foreign Asset Control, OFAC, which is the kind of guardian of sanctions in the US, we got a blanket exemption. NGOs and organizations like Turquoise Mountain, we were worried about putting money into Afghanistan, being hauled off to the United States to go to jail. As a trustee of the Turquoise Mountain, I didn't fancy spending time in an American jail courtesy of the Department of Justice, because I'm sending money into Afghanistan as part of the charity. But they've given us broad licenses to do the work. I think Lenny's quite right in that if the Taliban are not really interested in development assistance, then what leverage have you got? Because withholding development assistance is one of the leverages we've got. We may just have to accept that we don't have the sort of, given the Taliban's propensity and tolerance for pain, which they're prepared to, and deprivation, which they're prepared to undergo on behalf of the Afghan people, we may have to just put some of our usual tools aside. For instance, the Americans have taken the $9 billion of Afghan assets that were frozen in the US, and they've allocated $3.5 billion of that to potentially pay off claims against the Taliban for 9/11, and used $3.5 billion for humanitarian assistance. But what they need to do is release some liquidity for the central bank to operate, so that the banking system can get going, so that the Afghans can begin to have a functioning economy, and that they can get back to work and not be dependent completely on handouts from the UN and the international community. So there's a little bit of it that says to me, and I agree with Lenny, some of the traditional tools are just not there. we ought to just, in my view, let, the old Leninist thing, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Open up the economy, let the Afghans, run businesses, have a central bank. One of our inhibitions is we can't use a banking system. We can't pay our Afghan employees. We're having to take cash in. We're having to use hawala systems, money changing systems, which is not going to be sufficient for a whole economy. So I think we have to accept that the sanctions on the individuals are not going to be lifted. What we should be pressurizing Western governments, particularly the US, is to create the circumstances in which a banking system can be reestablished. That if the Taliban don't want our development assistance, then so be it. We will work through NGOs. I think Najibullah quite rightly says, look for the Afghan NGOs. The last 20 years hasn't been wasted. We have built up an incredible capacity within Afghanistan. There are lots of Afghan civil society organizations who can deliver stuff. So, we need to work with Afghans on the ground, push resources through them so that they can deliver. And in the end, you will strengthen Afghan society and create an alternative to what I would call this medieval government that's there. If the Afghans themselves are empowered through NGOs, through delivery mechanisms, through private clinics, through private health centers, providing for the Afghan people, you're going to create a very powerful civil society organization, which ultimately will be able to challenge the Taliban peacefully, not militarily.
Thank you. Najib, would you like to respond?
Yeah, thank you. I will just add on a few things, and Lenny and Mr. William rightly mentioned that, but I would like just to add maybe a few other points. So because of the sanctions, so somebody has to think whether the sanction has really affected this de facto government or the ordinary Afghan civilians. But from my point of view, that at the end of the day, it has suffered the civilians. And I will give you a few examples. For example, in terms of the new funding, or just starting arriving to Afghanistan through the UN system. But also some of the NGOs, when they have the approved funding from donors from outside, so the difficulty is that how can they get the funding to Afghanistan? And that is because of the sanction. We cannot, or other NGOs, everybody is suffering from this problem. That they cannot, the banks from the West are not ready, or they cannot transfer fund to NGOs and civil society organization in order to be able to deliver the services. So the banking in the financial sector has very badly affected by these sanctions. So that means that the ordinary Afghans, they cannot withdraw. They can only withdraw up to $300 in a month. In a week, and then for this $300, you have to stay in a long queue early in the morning and to get that 300. So that has basically limited the purchase power of the people. So that then basically affected the entire economy. And also because of the sanctions, the donors say that the NGOs or the civil society organization should not pay tax to the government, even the electricity bill. So at the end of the day, the NGOs will suffer, because if you cannot pay the tax, and if you do not pay the tax, then this de facto government will come and knock your door and will penalize you, and also in some cases probably they will get the registration back from you. So that means that if these sanctions exist that way, so gradually, the NGOs have to stop their operation, and then finally they have to be penalized, and the whole 20 years investment in this civil society organization will gradually disappear. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you, Najib. William, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I just want to make a point, Najibullah's point there. There is, in fact, an OFAC exemption. So NGOs are able to pay electricity bills. They are able to pay legitimate government, even government taxes, which there is an OFAC there is an OFAC general license, which exempts NGOs and others from doing normal business in Afghanistan, which may involve paying some for some services and even taxes. So the Americans have been quite flexible in that sense. But Najibullah's main point is absolutely clear. Without a banking system, how does the society operate? And they haven't allowed that to happen yet.
Thank you. I think that moves on to a question that arose from William's presentation, which is, given that it's obvious that sanctions right now, as they are not an effective tool, and a lot of the kind of international diplomacy tools haven't been effective, do you think that leads to the idea that international law and diplomacy as it is right now is not fit for purpose in addressing the situation in Afghanistan? And I would be interested in hearing the perspective from a diplomat, but also from the other speakers, if they believe that this structure that we exist in right now is not effective as is.
Well, I can tell you now, international law is not fit for purpose. We've seen that over Ukraine. The UN system, which was set up to establish the International Court of Justice, the international system that was set up after the Second World War is not functioning. So there's no way of enforcing international law. You can say this is I mean, that's not quite true, because people have been held to account at the International Court of Justice, and there is a system going on at the moment where violations of international law that are occurring in Ukraine are being documented, and there could be some cases. But in terms of preventing unjust wars or preventing abuses of human rights or abuses of humanitarian law, there isn't a functioning system that can do it. It's the power of public opinion that does have some resonance, and it does have some power. But enforcing international law in the current world order is extremely difficult. It's never been easy, but it's even more difficult when you've got competing ideologies and competing world powers and competing visions of the world, and even competing versions of the truth. That makes it very difficult to enforce international law.
Thank you. Would any other speakers like to weigh in on this? If not, I will move on to the next question. So obviously we got a lot of questions arising from Mr. Patey's discussion, because he mirrored it back onto our audience and asked them for their contributions. So I got a few comments from people discussing that they believe that that given that when deaths are imminent, the idea of a compromise with the Taliban seems important to prevent these deaths. So we got comments from Diane Stout and Bash Ali to discussing that in general. And then Yi Sang Yong asked in the chat that in regards to kind of focuses being moved away and the idea that public opinion is a driving force of humanitarian aid, focuses were moved away from Afghanistan and now towards Ukraine. And so Yi Sang Yong asked the very broad question of how do we prevent the next Afghanistan or Ukrainian current crisis? Which is a very broad question. So I'll push it over to the speakers and see if anyone wants to attempt that answer.
I'll have a go. I'm a cynic about this, because I'm long enough to remember all the other things that we did wrong and said never again will we allow anything like this to happen again. The reality is that it always does. What you can do is get better at dealing with it. You can learn the lessons. I mean, one of the lessons we've learned, I have learned certainly, and I think probably most people have learned, is that invading another country is never a good idea. Whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan, or Ukraine, trying to invade another country is never a good idea. But if you do invade another country, you have to be ready for the long term. And part of the problem in Afghanistan is that we thought that we lost interest after 20 years. We invaded in 2001, And by 2021, the Americans had lost any interest in Afghanistan and were no longer to pay what I consider to be a minimal price. This comes back to the why did we withdraw so precipitately? And I think we could have stayed in much longer. We could have engaged in serious negotiations with the Taliban. We could have reached a political compromise. Now, these are the lessons you learn, but people knew that at the time. But politics, the particular circumstances, the politics of individual countries, what's happening on the ground, all intervene to create a new generation of people who get to make their own mistakes. And so I'm very cynical when people say, we must never let this happen again. It's a very worthy ambition, but my experience tells me that we're fated to continue to make the same mistakes over and over again.
Thank you. In the chat right now, Bashali has said, what steps are needed now? Which is, again, a very broad question, but if anyone would like to attempt it. Okay, and as we heard in William's presentation, is that he wanted a group discussion basically about how far people would be willing to go in like recognizing the Taliban if it meant decreasing harm and giving humanitarian aid. So I think we can open this up to everyone who would like to contribute. I think it's an evocative question of what level of compromise are people willing to have. And so I think getting multiple perspectives on this would be very beneficial. So I see Lenny has raised her hand, so if she would like to start.
Yeah, just to maybe come in on this and the questions of how far people are willing to go, and sort of the question of recognition. I think while there are a lot of in an international relation, I think there are a lot of sort of expected sort of moves in certain countries where you would sort of traditionally, judging on their relations of the neighboring countries, what their sort of suggestion would be. Now, in the situation now of the de facto authorities and the Taliban, is very interesting because recognition was sort of withheld so far very stringently from all sides. Russia, China, Iran, they all packed recognition now on sort of an inclusive representative government, which of course is a very sort of not very easily measurable, very elusive sort of characteristic. We have also seen just in the last month that after the US announcement on the frozen assets, the Taliban themselves seem to recognize that maybe recognition as such, it might be something that's not going to come very easy and not going to come very soon. So we've actually heard Haqqani mention that now there's sort of a tacit silent recognition that has been taken. So the Taliban has sort of, I think, seemed somehow come to terms with the fact that immediate recognition is not going to come, which I think is also interesting because it will, on the one hand, remain sort of a format of leverage. On the other hand, I think it's not sort of returning to business as usual, for sure not. But I think there's a sort of this new normal that we have to deal with. Sort of agreeing that the Taliban will not get full recognition, but also noting that we have to continue to work with them. And so I think some of what the new UNAMA mandate is proposing a series of pathways that are not necessarily chronological, not necessarily automatic, but also showing to the Taliban sort of what the expectations are, and then also sort of ways on how they can maybe achieve one or the other, some of them parallel tracks. So this is economic reforms, this is sort of legal reforms, and a number of other issues as well attached to this. So maybe these are the kind of very vague, unfortunately, steps forward. And if I may take another question where I was not quick enough to respond earlier, on civil society issues as such, maybe just two observations. I've been in Afghanistan for 12 years now, and I know that civil society has tremendously grown. There's some amazing work done. A lot of young educated people have been really sort of also even this on a volunteer basis being part of civil society. But many of them have unfortunately left the country. I understand why they left the country, for fear of their own lives, for fear of their families, for fear of the future in the country. But I think that is sort of something that we just need to appreciate, because I think it has significantly crippled any efforts from within the country. And if I may be so frank, I think there's also some tensions between those in the diaspora asking for maybe stronger sanctions or punishments or other issues And then those Afghans, especially also women still in the country, who then feel the pressure to speak out, but knowing that it might not be a very safe environment. So that's the one part. And the second part, maybe also on women, because I think there's a question about civil society and how they help women. I just came back from Mazar Sharif in Balkh province in the north of Afghanistan. And while it is true that you see less women, and while it's true, I think that women have, if it's not outright forbidden to return to work, there are a lot of restrictions placed on this. And I think there's also a certain amount of like self-restriction of women not willing to cross a line that they might not see and then sort of incur any punishment. But there are women out there. I've met the director of several libraries. The chief editor of a 100-year-old newspaper is also a woman. So certain women are managed to eke out their positions, but I think it's very sort of dependent on the location and also what kind of Taliban de facto officials you're actually encountering. What I thought was really interesting is that over the last weeks, we have observed that female entrepreneurs have been sort of really pushing for their space and have even sort of reached up all the way sort of to the deputy de facto prime minister level to sort of make their voices heard and sort of petition for themselves. And I think this is an initiative that has been homegrown, that has been come from inside Afghanistan, not from the international community, not from diaspora. So there are, and they were very successful in that. So I think there is still some hope of encouraging some women who've remained in Afghanistan who have very concrete steps, in particular if it's sort of the economic route, to really sort of make headway in sort of pushing the Taliban on certain issues and sort of getting more of their rights back. I mean, they should never have to get them back, but in that context, I think that's sort of the way to how to describe it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Leoni, would you like to contribute?
Yeah, thanks. It was just something that William was saying before about, you know, if people are willing to compromise, you know, especially when it comes to the Taliban, you know, can we offer aid or can we offer assistance if that means that, you know, somehow it looks like people are supporting the Taliban. But I suppose it depends. I think it depends on who or where you are. So obviously the stakes are a lot higher. You know, if you ask somebody who's living in Afghanistan every day, experiencing these issues every day, then they would probably come up with a different answer than somebody like us who's sat in this panel right now, or for somebody, for me in particular in the UK. It's easy for us to say, oh yeah, you know, we can offer this amount of financial assistance and we should be compromising and we should be having these negotiations with the Taliban, but we're not the ones experiencing the conflict every day or these issues every day. So then I think, again, this question comes back to, you know, decision making, who's making the decisions, who's having an input in the decision making for a start, because a lot of the mistakes in the past is that the people of Afghanistan haven't been consolidated and they haven't been considered. You know, their input hasn't been considered in terms of, you know, what they think needs to happen. So I understand, you know, this is an open discussion and it's really important to offer different perspectives, but at the same time, those perspectives are going to be really dependent on where you are and the stakes that you have in the situation. You know, if the stakes aren't so high, it's easy to say, oh yeah, you know, let's put all this money in and let's negotiate with the Taliban. But then at the same time, how does that play out for the, you know, civilians' everyday lives? But it's just a thought.
Thank you very much. Rick, would you like to contribute as well?
Yeah, thank you. This is a fabulous discussion. Perhaps widening the geographic scope again for possible lessons, and I'd be very interested to hear from practitioners how this could conceivably work on the ground in Afghanistan. But having had some working experience myself with de facto states in the post-Soviet space, some of which are partially recognized, namely by Russia and a handful of other states, this has been a dilemma for especially Euro-Atlantic organizations. And they have made a type of compromise. I mean, one that's literally called engagement without recognition. So to my mind, there are possible trade-offs that can be done, still retaining a moral imperative, which strikes me as important. And then within that, different forms of relations, because technically speaking, foreign policy is done by states to states, states within international organizations, which are extensions of states. But then there's foreign relations, so that it can be done at a different level, which is not that formality of recognition. So in cases where there are issues about non-recognition, there can be relations, say, between cities, between mayors, between sports teams, chess teams, things like that, that don't invoke the full recognition either of a government or of a state or both. So I'm wondering, and I was quite struck by William's comment about a political compromise, what that political compromise would look like, and if there are ways that we can mute some of our, I'll say it, moral repulsion in order to facilitate some of or more of the assistance that achingly seems to be needed. So thank you for letting me say that, and I'd be very interested in others' views on this.
Thank you. I'd be curious if Najib has a response to this, given that he has a local NGO perspective, if he would be willing to contribute. Sorry, I know I'm putting him on the spot.
Yeah, but basically there are two things. One is the politics, and the other is the humanitarian aspects. So on the politics, recognition of the current government, that is one thing, and then responding to humanitarian challenges to take care of the children and women. So that's another issue. So I think these two should not be mixed up. So therefore, recognition to the full recognition of this de facto authorities is one thing. But I think since we all agree that at the end, the ordinary Afghans or the civilians will suffer, particularly children and women. So in that regard, if full recognition is not to be considered, but at least the international community needs to be engaged with this de facto authorities, at least for the fund transfer, for for humanitarian response. That means that will also help the human rights. So these two things not need to be necessarily mixed up. And for the short term, I think the international community needs to be engaged with the government, with its de facto authorities, for the humanitarian purposes. And then in the short, in long term, the international community needs to work with the government to convince them and then to proceed that way. But for the time being, the engagement with this de facto authorities need for the humanitarian purposes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. William, would you like to contribute?
Yeah, I'm just on this point because I want to answer Bash Ali's question, what do you need to do next? And it's related to this. I mean, I think we can, without recognize, Britain has a long established policy that we don't recognize governments, we recognize states. So the United Kingdom recognizes Afghanistan as a country. We don't have any process of formally recognizing a government. So we can, and the British government are de facto dealing with the Taliban. Envoys have been to Kabul, they're in Qatar, they're dealing with them. That's fine. You don't have to have the formal recognition. Some states do, but a lot of them don't. But the one step you can take would be to release some of the Afghan dollar reserves that would enable the central bank of Afghanistan to operate. And releasing some of those reserves, I mean, the Afghan central bank couldn't absorb the $9 billion that the Americans have frozen. You could release $1 billion, which would give enough liquidity to the central bank to allow them to open a banking system to deal with the issue Najibullah was talking about, of Afghans being able to get access to their savings. At the moment, people have money in their own accounts, but they're not able to get it. So you could do that, and that would be a stimulus to the economy. But in answer to Bash Ali's questions about how do you deal with help the 17 million children, in the short term, the only way you do that is through the UN and through international organizations and through international NGOs. And it's about listening. And somebody else said, I think it was Leoni said, you've got to listen to the Afghans themselves, listen to what they want. And I think we have to be a little bit careful about listening too much to the diaspora because they have a particular point of view. We need to listen to the Afghans who've stayed and who are still there. And they have a point of view, and there are many of them, and there are many organizations that continue to operate. So listen to them. There's a lady called Fatima Gailani. Fatima Gailani was at the talks in Doha. A woman, she's from a very prominent Sufi family in Afghanistan. She has been talking to the Taliban about through the Red Cross associations and NGOs. Talking to them, having a dialogue with them, arguing with them about what sort of Islamic emirate they want to have, or do they want to have a Pushtun-Wali state? Because some of these restrictions that are being imposed have got nothing to do with Islam. They're about Pushtun tribal values. And so there are Afghan women having this debate with the Taliban right now. We need to support them. We need to listen to them. We need to hear the organizations that are working. Najibullah is there in Afghanistan. We can listen to people and support them, give them money, respond to the UN appeals for money. That's what we can do right now to help the Afghan people. But I'm talking about, in the next few weeks, and in the months to come, we need to get the banking system up and running, and then allow the entrepreneurship of the Afghans to flourish.
Thank you very much. So as we're discussing, the youth population as well as mentioned, we had a question coming in that says that following on from the UN Secretary General's Our Common Agenda, one of the sections commented on the need for member states to consider youth and future generations in deciding how member states will move forward with national policy. So if this comes into effect, what effect do any of the speakers here think that the need to consider future generations will have both to the international response to Afghanistan and in Afghanistan? That's kind of a mouthful question, but if any of the speakers would like to contribute, that would be great.
I hesitate mainly because I'm so far away from the next generation that it would be presumptuous. But other than to say that, without listening to young people in Afghanistan, there is no future. They are the future, and we do have to listen. Otherwise, what's the point? So, I think, and related to that, we need to focus on education. We spent 20 years getting Afghanistan from a position of illiteracy to very high levels of literacy. That's where we are now. We haven't lost that yet. And that's quite a focus to maintain that level of literacy amongst boys and girls. Let's not lose that. Everyone thinks the last 20 years in Afghanistan was a waste because the Taliban in charge now. Now, Afghanistan is a very different country in 2022 from what it was in 2001. And we should try and hold on to that, making sure that young people are educated so they can make informed choices about their own future.
Thank you. Leoni, would you like to contribute?
Yeah, I think it's just really important to not forget about how easily it is, especially for young people, to become disenfranchised and disillusioned with the situation, especially not just in the context of Afghanistan, but other contexts as well. If there isn't the economic means, or if young people don't have the ability to, gain an education, go out and get a job, and they're left with very few options, then we've seen what happens time and time again, and what young people can turn to, whether that's radicalization, whether that's to leave the country, if they are left with no other choice. So, it's really important to not forget that. And I know it's kind of like, in hindsight, we can say, the younger generation of the future or whatever it might be, and it can seem quite hopeful or unrealistic. There is an element of truth to that, because if you don't put money in and put prospects in for young people, especially in Afghanistan, they're going to be left with very little options, very little choices to choose from, in which case, young people will make misinformed choices, or they will turn to other groups that are able to provide them with financial means or financial stability, which is the exact problem that, especially narratives in the West are trying to avoid. They don't want people to turn to even crime or other organizations. So there has to be options for young people, and that those options do lie in education, and they lie in the job sector, and just, again, rebuilding civil society and having an economy. And you can't do that if the banks are frozen.
Thank you, Leoni. Lenny, would you like to contribute?
Yes. Just to maybe sort of flesh out a bit more the idea that the last 20 years are not really lost. They're de facto for the officials now that are sort of a mid to younger generation, and many of them actually had benefited at least partially from the education in the last 20 years. Either as elementary, secondary, but some even have graduated or at least taken some courses in the university system inside Afghanistan or outside Afghanistan. We see a lot of Taliban who've come back. For example, the de facto Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson Balkhi, who grew up in New Zealand, for example. So you have a different generation even amongst the Taliban. We've seen in the very first ceasefire in 2018, young Talibs coming into the cities, eating ice cream, getting haircuts, sort of like try to see what the life is like in cities. And I think this is sort of not that it's had a major impact, but I think it had enough of an impact that we're not losing everything that was gained in the last 20 years. Maybe also to point out that I think there's a lot more pragmatism now as well. And I think pragmatism sometimes overrules some of the more Islamic Sharia law and also Pashtun-Wali or Afghan tradition informed decisions. So for example, we've now heard that there's exemptions made for widows that they can run their shops without a mahram being around. And a number of other sort of issues where clearly, on the one hand, it's forbidden for males to lecture women in universities, but we then see somebody from the de facto authorities heading the Department for Information and Culture saying that he is actually teaching female journalism students. So clearly, not all the rules are applied in the same way on the ground. And I think this is in part because people are not willing to backtrack on what they've achieved in the past. So I think we also need to appreciate that and actually maybe also encourage people who not necessarily looking at the larger policy levels, but those who sort of eking out slowly more space for themselves in various areas, including for women's participation, also youth participation.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very interesting discussion. Moving beyond that, Catriona has just posed a question in the chat directed explicitly at Najib and has asked if he is able to share his perspectives from the youth that are engaged in sex education and capacity building workshops in the AFGA Youth Network. So if Najib, if you had that perspective, that would be beneficial, I'm sure.
Thank you, Katrina, for the question. So before coming to your question, let me also give some thoughts on the question that was raised earlier. We all understand that youths are fleeing the country, so it's a kind of brain drain. That is very risky for the future of Afghanistan, and this is because of the bad economic situation and unemployment in the country. They do not see their future, and then they are fleeing the country, unfortunately. So in order to prevent that, or to keep them within the country, particularly the young youth, girls and youth, I think to strengthen or create the employment opportunity through different mechanisms, and also the education sector, which is one of the big achievement over the last 20 years. So we need not to lose them and support somehow the education sector and the infrastructure that was built. For example, a lot of private universities, not only in Kabul, but all around the country, there are hundreds of private universities, institutes, and private schools. So because of this bad economic situation, the people cannot afford or they have difficulties in affording sending their children to the private schools. So somehow, if the international community support the education sector, not to lose these private universities and institutes and schools. So that is something that needs support at the moment. And with regards to the Katrina's question on the youth engagement in some of the AFCA's workshops in capacity building activities or awareness on sex education, even after August 15, AFCA continued with organizing such workshops, but only the difference was that it was earlier, it was mixed between boys and girls, but now after August, we organized a number of those workshops in capacity building activities and awareness on sex education and reproductive health, but in different classes, like in different sessions for girls and also for boys. So we continued with organizing those, and we will continue. We have plans to continue with that, but we also understand that this is a very sensitive area, so we need to be careful about this. But we have the plans to continue with that, but we need to be careful about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Moving on, we are getting to the phase where we're going to start wrapping up. So if anyone has any final questions, please put them in the chat or raise your hand. Moving beyond that, we obviously had a few questions about the rights of women and children. And whilst that is undeniably a really important factor to discuss. I think there's also kind of the converse is that given that there is such a focus, especially in like quote unquote westernized media on women and children, have any of you in your expertise noticed like an impact or a certain level of, for lack of a better word, like dehumanization of Afghan men, given that they are not being focused at all in Western media? And I was wondering if anyone had any sort of insight in that. If not, we got a few questions regarding how, oh, sorry, Lenny, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think even before August, I think sometimes the role men play in Afghan society was sometimes maybe a bit misportrayed. And I think it was also challenging because they were also responding to expectations very often, because I think the expectations for men did not quite keep up in step with what their expectations were for women or what they could be doing in the future. I think now there's a lot of a sense, at least that's been my personal experience, that Afghan men are trying to be very protective of their families. And I think maybe sometimes being well intended to not bring harm to their wives, their daughters, nieces, nephews, nieces, and other sort of female family members, that they may be a bit overprotective. And I think this is maybe also in the larger realm of many women even preferring to go outside and rather therefore maybe covering up more conservatively than it is expected, or maybe restricting some of the interactions they're planning to have more than before, just to make sure that they're not necessarily sort of coming up against on some of these invisible boundaries. And I think that's also the same for men as well. I think they're quite, as somebody pointed out to me in Kabul, I think you see that the men's outfits in terms of growing beards, wearing traditional shalwar kameez, is actually more frequent and a bigger change than when you look at women going outside, who might have still just wearing a trench coat, a longer trench coat, but the headscarf as well. Of course, in rural areas, it might be a bit stricter. But I think sort of these norms, especially for men, is also very, expectation for men, I think, have grown, but sort of the power they have to change things has actually become more diminished. Sort of with the Taliban arrival. So I think this is also maybe something where, yes, we're all focusing very much on women, but I think it's we shouldn't forget that human rights are for everybody, and that also I think men are equally struggling to access some of their rights the same that women do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Leoni, would you like to respond?
Yeah, just really quickly, I was just, without going too much into like the academic side of things, but there are definitely gendered narratives when it comes to Afghanistan. So obviously this idea of women needing saving in the past, and the West appearing as this savior, and I don't want to go into it too much, but this idea of that the men became, men in Afghanistan became this idea of the other, and it was a lot easier for men to be demonized and dehumanized, especially from a Western point of view, because they were seen as the problem. Men in the Taliban were seen as the oppressors, they were seen as the terrorists, and all of these labels have stuck around for the past 20 years, if not longer. Whereas because the women were then seen as the victims, these narratives have stayed. And as I said earlier on, not only has this made people overlook women as in ways of resistance, that women have been empowered over the past 20 years, as multiple panelists have pointed out and William pointed out, the situation in Afghanistan now is completely different than it was 20 years ago. And women's position in society has also changed. And I think that is obviously a positive thing, but at the same time, it's one of the reasons why it's become easier to demonize men, especially in Afghanistan, and see them in a negative light, as opposed to seeing them also as victims. That kind of narrative and the gender narrative that exists isn't the same for both men and women. And it is problematic because then, if people aren't as sympathetic to the men as they are the women and children, although yes, they do face different issues and we understand that, then it becomes a problem of who needs assistance and who needs aid. If you think that Afghanistan men are less deserving of aid than the women, then there's going to be a serious problem, especially moving forward. Yeah, I don't want to go too much into it. I'm happy to suggest if any of the audience are interested in like further readings on this or anything like that, I'm happy to share them.
Great, thank you very much. And finally, I think we'll hear from Fiona and then wrap up the discussion.
Yeah, I think actually Lenny touched on it. Yes, there is a huge focus, of course, on women's and girls' rights, But as Lenny said, I mean, you know, they're half the population, and then we have the other population who also have human rights. And I have to say that when we look at the violations that we have recorded, you know, it's some of the most severe treatment when it comes to treatment, ill treatment, torture, or enforced disappearances, of killings. You know, men are really, you know, as victims suffering from it. So you know, for me, it's very important that we have the emphasis on women's rights and girls, but I really do think we should, you know, talk about the human rights of the people of Afghanistan and the need that, you know, for all of them, men, women, boys and girls. So just to really keep that at the fore.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for such an engaging discussion. I'm going to wrap up now and pass over to Hannah to close out the meeting.
Thank you so much, Christina, for your really great moderation and an amazing discussion, and really lots of really thought-provoking questions, I think, coming from the audience. And I'd also like to thank our guests for their responses. I'd also like to, I suppose, highlight some key points from the discussion, or I thought were key points. So we talked about putting power in the hands of the Afghan people peacefully through civil society organizations, putting pressure on the US government to help open, or international governments to help open a central banking system, and how we need to open a central banking system because of the real negative impact on civilians and the prospects of youth and future generations. So, and a very nice question posed by William on how far would you be willing to deal with the Taliban to alleviate the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan? I do agree that is a very difficult question. It's actually a question I also had and wanted to post today, but you beat me to it. And I'd like to highlight some responses to that on how the perspectives, Leoni said this, I believe perspectives are very much dependent on where you are and the situation you are in. The formalities of recognition and non-recognition and political compromise, and what that political compromise would look like. And something as well that I believe Najib said is how recognition is one thing, but at the end of the day, it's the ordinary Afghans, especially children and women, who suffer the most. And as such, engagement with de facto government is needed for humanitarian purposes. I also really like the discussion on gender bias and perspectives at the end. And I believe this is brought up towards the beginning of the discussion. And it's very on topic. It's very on topic given the upcoming Commission on the Status of Women in a week and a half. So I'd just like to bring that up. And I'd like to close. I'm aware of time. I'd like to close, and I hope that everyone in attendance today has been able to take away a few points that you can either think about, take action on, either as individuals, or maybe an idea that you've thought of or was brought up today that you'd like to introduce in your community. And we hope that, or your group of friends, and we hope that we would keep in touch with all of you, both participants and guest speakers, and continue reaching out to other civil society bodies, either working in Afghanistan or working towards providing humanitarian assistance or aid in Afghanistan. And before we close, if it's all right with everyone, I would like to suggest that we could maybe take a photo, if it's all right with everyone. And for that, if you don't want to be in the photo, please feel free to turn your cameras off. That is really completely fine. The photo will just be a screenshot of my screen, I suppose. But I just like to thank everyone for attending, and I'll give people a couple of seconds to turn on the videos if they'd like to be in the photo. Get some publicity. And I'll give a couple minutes. I see people are turning on their cameras. Okay. Okay, I'll count to 3 and then take a picture, just so everyone is aware. 1, 2, 3, smile. Okay, the picture is taken. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending our roundtable on Afghanistan. I look forward to sharing with you the recording and our follow-up report from this event, and I hope to see you at future events as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank
Hannah.
you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, that was great. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the speakers and Hannah.